My name is Anna Whitaker, 34 years old, living in a small town in Colorado, where people still believe family is supposed to be the last safe place. But during a holiday trip with my step-family, my mother shoved my grandmother on herself to the side of the road with nothing but a $2 bill. Then she looked straight at me and said, "If you open your mouth, I'll leave both of you here to die." And she meant it. I was slapped until I bled, then abandoned under the burning sun with an elderly woman barely able to stand. Have you ever been treated like disposable trash by your own family? Have you ever stayed silent because you thought you weren't worth protecting? Leave a comment if you've ever felt alone right in the middle of your own family. Hit like and subscribe if you're ready to follow me to the end of this truth, because what happened next was even more brutal. I remember vividly the night my grandmother picked me up from the foster center. I was 13, wearing an old sweater with a torn shoulder, standing by a fogged-up window, watching her slowly step out of a beat-up silver car, her face blurred by the rain. No one had told me she was coming. No one said goodbye. They just shoved a cloth bag of hand-me-downs into my hands and said, "Go with her." So I went. 2 years before that, my stepmother, Marlene, had dropped me off at the center with a handwritten statement. "This girl shows violent tendencies. She pushed her grandmother, shattered a glass on me. The family can't control her." I still remember the police officer's face that day. He never looked at me, just read from the file like every word was gospel. I tried to scream that I didn't do anything, that grandma had just slipped on the steps behind the house. But no one listened. Marlene stood there crying, shaking, her arms covered in scratches. I knew she had made them herself before calling the ambulance. After that, I was labeled a threat. Grandma had no legal custody, and my father, I never even knew who he was. His name was just on my birth certificate and in a faded black and white photo my grandmother had once hidden in a frame. I grew up in a place where people only called each other by case numbers. I learned to shrink myself, to stop asking, to stop speaking, to stop hoping. Every time Marlene visited, which was rare, she'd say only one thing: "If you'd been better, maybe your real mother wouldn't have dumped you." That line sank into my head like a rusty nail. I used to believe it. I believed my mother, Deborah, had abandoned me before I could even write my name, that she saw me as a burden, as something not worth keeping. But there was one person who never believed that: my grandmother, Eleanor. From the day she brought me home, she never mentioned the past. She just quietly cooked, did laundry, took me to school, and picked me up, as if those 2 lost years had never happened. Some nights I'd lie awake, listening to her restless shifting in the next room, her shallow breaths and the long, dragging coughs. I knew she was tired, knew she was aging, but she never once complained. She'd just stroke my hair and say, "You're still a good kid. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." One day, I secretly searched through her drawer to find a savings book, because we couldn't afford my end-of-term tuition. I didn't find money. But I found an old, dented tin box tucked into the corner of the closet. Inside were letters, all of them written in a familiar hand, elegant, round, soft. Deborah. I froze. I had never seen that handwriting before. My hands shook as I opened the first letter. "Mom, I'm sorry I had to leave. I couldn't take Anna with me yet, but I swear I'll come back." Tear-stained lines, promises, crossed-out addresses, rewritten in trembling ink. There were over 20 letters, all written steadily over the 3 years after she disappeared. Then, nothing. I walked out of Grandma's room holding one of the letters, its corner torn from rereading. When she returned, I couldn't hide it. "Why didn't you ever show me these?" She didn't answer right away. She sat down, set her grocery bag on the floor, and looked at me. Her eyes were still like a winter lake, so deep I couldn't tell if I was standing on the shore or sinking. "Because you needed to grow up without hate," she said softly. "You needed to know how to live before you could learn how to forgive." My throat closed. "I didn't want you growing up to be like Deborah," she continued. "She was strong once. She tried to protect you, but she was broken, forced into silence. And then she disappeared, thinking she still had time to come back. But you kept them all." I clutched the letter. because I knew someday you would ask. I don't remember how long I cried in her arms that night. She didn't promise to help me find my mother. She didn't say whether Deborah was still alive. Just one line she repeated like a prayer. Your mother didn't abandon you. Someone else forced her to leave. I didn't understand it then, but years later, standing in that scorching parking lot, watching her get pushed to the curb, that $2 bill spinning into the grass, I finally did. My grandmother's life was a series of silent acts of protection, and I couldn't let it happen again. The sun bore down on me like a cloak heavy with dust and despair. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. Her body felt weightless, as if even the breeze could tip her over. Her feet slipped a few times on the damp grass, but she didn't cry out or ask questions. We left the roadside without a clear direction, only a vague memory that to the left of the woods there might be an old roof we'd passed. On a narrow trail covered in fallen leaves, our footsteps were swallowed by the sounds of the forest. Branches rustled. At one point I thought I heard someone call my name, but when I turned it was just her tired eyes, gray hair plastered to her forehead. Sweat and dust coated her skin in a dull film. I gripped her hand gently. Almost there, I whispered, even though I didn't know how much farther we could go. The sky darkened, a cold wind slipped down my collar, making me shiver. Rain started, heavy drops like stones hitting my neck and wrists. I pulled the scarf over her head, took off my jacket, and draped it around her shoulders like a makeshift shield. She trembled. Are you cold? I asked. She nodded faintly, lips pale. When night came and mist drifted like smoke, I nearly gave up. We'd walked for over an hour, and she couldn't stand anymore. I helped her sit beneath a massive tree, my heart racing with fear. I scanned the area, and then I saw it. A rusted tin roof behind the pine trees, less than 100 yards away. I practically carried her. The old shed stood like a relic from another century, warped wooden walls, door barely hanging on its hinges, but it was still upright. I pushed it open, the scent of mildew and moss overwhelming. In the corner, a pile of dried grass, yellowed and dusty, but enough to spread out for rest. I laid her down, pulled off my jacket, wiped her forehead. Her skin burned, breath shallow and uneven. I kicked off my shoes and looked around for anything else. An old burlap sack, a torn blanket, soggy cardboard. I gathered them all, layering them over her like scraps of leftover warmth. Rain pounded louder. Wind shrieked through the cracks in the wood. I pulled her closer, wrapped my arms around her shoulders, my chest hollow like the room we were in. In the quiet between raindrops hitting the roof, she gently clutched my wrist, trying to whisper. I leaned down. She just breathed. No words. I pulled the small bag closer, found the last bottle of water, poured a few sips into the cap and touched it to her lips. She drank a little, then drifted off. As I pulled the blanket over her chest, a scrap of paper slipped from her coat pocket, danced on the breeze, then landed on the dried grass. I picked it up. It was an old postcard, edges worn, sweat-stained, and time-soaked, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor, don't let them take the girl. Wait for me to come back. I froze. That handwriting. I'd seen it before. On the letters hidden in the tin box. It was my mother's. My throat tightened. Those few words felt like a scream. A plea, a promise, a cry for help. There was no return address. Just one final line. Written in small letters near the bottom edge. Montana, 2004. I looked at her. She was still lying there, her face tired but peaceful. So she had kept it all these years, without a word, without an explanation. And now, in the middle of this cold, misty forest rain, the postcard slipped out as if fate itself was whispering to me. Don't give up. I pressed it into my palm, feeling the damp fibers of the paper. I'm still here, I whispered. I won't let them take you again. And I won't let anyone keep my mother hidden from me another day. The rain kept falling steadily, but something inside me was shifting. It was no longer about escaping or protecting. It was about searching, digging up what had been buried for so long. and I knew the journey had just begun. I didn't remember when I fell asleep in that old storage shed. When I opened my eyes, the sky was still gray, but the rain had stopped. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. My grandmother was still beside me, breathing softly with a faint wheeze. I gently touched her forehead. She was still feverish. I couldn't let her stay here another night. I tiptoed outside, trying to get a cell signal, but only 2 weak bars showed up. I called the only number I remembered, the clinic on the outskirts of town where I had once volunteered during college. No answer. I tried heading back toward the main road, hoping to find help or even just a vending machine to get something to reduce her fever. I hadn't even reached the forest edge when I saw an old pickup parked by the roadside, its hood wide open. A silver-haired man stood hunched over it, wrench in hand, muttering to himself while peering into the engine. He looked up when he heard the crackling of dry leaves under my feet. "Morning," he said, his voice gravelly. "You okay?" I hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I'm fine, but my grandmother isn't. She's had a fever since last night. I'm trying to find a way to get her to the nearest clinic." He placed the wrench down on the hood. "That clinic's at least 7 miles out. You can't get her there on foot. Bring her to my shop first. I've got a back room, clean water, a real bed." Before I could respond, he was already at the car door, pulling out a water bottle and a pack of wet wipes from the back seat. "Name's Frank Dillard. I run a small auto shop off Route 37. The one with the wooden gear sign out front." I was cautious, but his eyes didn't flinch. No pity, no prying, just honesty. I returned to the shed and asked for his help getting Grandma into the truck. She was too weak to move on her own, but still tried to mouth a hello when she saw Frank. "Thank you," I said as I adjusted the cloth around her in the back seat. Frank nodded silently. On the ride to his shop, he turned on a small radio. Faint jazz tunes filled the silence. The truck rolled slowly past dry yellow fields, an old gas station, and finally turned onto a gravel road that led to a cluster of rustic buildings. The repair shop sat right by the shoulder, next to a small wooden house wrapped in ivy. Behind it were old sheds and a halved shipping container now used for spare parts. Frank led us into the back room. There was a fold-out bed, clean blankets, and a kettle boiling on a small stove. "Let her rest here," he said. "I've got some fever meds my ex-wife left behind. Still good." He fetched the medicine and a bowl of hot porridge. I looked around. Everything in the room was oddly tidy. Not fancy, but clearly cared for. Once Grandma had taken her meds and settled, I stepped out front. Frank was seated at a wooden table, steam rising from his coffee cup. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said first, "but I know when something's not right. I lost my daughter in an accident. Since then, I've learned to spot kids carrying weight they don't talk about." I stayed silent for a long time. Then, like something cracked open inside me, I spoke, bit by bit, about the stepmother, the slap, the $2 bill, the forest shed. I didn't cry. I just spoke, as if the words had been waiting for years. Frank listened closely, never interrupting, but when I mentioned the live stream video, he tensed. "You said someone filmed you being hit and left by the roadside?" "Yes. Her stepson. He live streamed it with a fake caption saying I kidnapped my own grandmother." Frank frowned, pulling out his phone. "Give me a minute." He walked toward the front desk where an old laptop sat. I repositioned Grandma gently, tucking the blanket around her. A few minutes later, Frank returned holding a small slip of paper. The license plate in the video was 6AB483. I ran it through a civilian lookup tool. Don't ask how I still have access. It's not registered to a person. I looked up. Not Marlene's name. No. The truck belongs to an LLC. Whitaker Family Holdings, based in the suburbs of Los Angeles. My heart started pounding. She put it under a company name to hide assets? "Or launder money," Frank said, his voice less gentle now. "Or avoid personal liability. Whatever it is, this isn't small, kid." I stared at my clenched hands. All these years, I'd believed I was just an abandoned daughter. rejected because I was weak. But now I realized maybe I was up against something far worse. Frank laid a hand on my shoulder. If you want to expose them, I know some old friends, ex-military investigators. They don't flinch from the truth. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window, at the slanting afternoon light casting across Grandma's frail frame. From somewhere deep inside, something stirred. Not anger, not fear. Hope. Fragile but real. I went to the county courthouse on a gloomy Monday morning, carrying a folder Frank had helped me print out on his garage printer. Medical records. Photos of Grandma's bruises from being pushed out of the car. Hospital receipts I had paid for. I included a transcript from the live stream. Manipulated as it was, I refused to hide from it. The court clerk flipped through the documents, then quietly said, "Emergency guardianship hearing is set for Wednesday morning. Presiding judge, Myra Jansen." I nodded, thanked her, and left to wait. Those 2 days were the longest winter of my life. I never left the hospital. Each time Grandma stirred, I held her hand and read aloud from an old letter my mother, Deborah, had written, hoping her words would tether Grandma to the present. She didn't speak, but her hand would sometimes squeeze mine, a faint signal. On the morning of the hearing, I wore an old office outfit, flats, and kept my mother's postcard in my coat pocket like a talisman. Frank drove me there without saying much, just one quiet reminder. Don't let anyone else write your story. The courtroom was small, with dark wood panels and air that smelled like old files. I sat on the left side, alone. Across from me, Marlene entered with 2 lawyers, in an ivory blazer and neatly pinned-up hair. Her eyes brushed over me like I was a misplaced object. Judge Jansen opened the file. Petitioner Anna Whitaker seeks emergency transfer of guardianship of Eleanor Whitaker from respondent Marlene Whitaker. Grounds cited: abuse, neglect, and endangerment. Respondent denies and submits rebuttal evidence. Marlene's lawyer stood and cued a tablet. In this clip, the court will see Ms. Whitaker pulling an elderly woman from a vehicle, engaging in a loud dispute and causing a fall. Additionally, there is evidence of financial manipulation, indicating questionable motives. I gripped the armrest as the video began. The part where Marlene drove off was cut. My scream was distorted. The scene of Grandma falling had been slowed down to make it look like I'd pushed her. "I didn't do that," I stood up, voice trembling but steady. "This video was doctored, and she was left on the roadside with only $2. I was trying to protect her." The judge looked at me. "Do you have any evidence to support your testimony?" "I have the medical receipts, a witness statement from the gas station, and photos taken when she was admitted to the hospital." "All right. The hearing will be paused to review the documents. While we await an independent investigation, Marlene's guardianship will remain in place. However, the court orders independent medical supervision and spending oversight." I collapsed into the seat, my chest tight and cold. Marlene gave me a small smirk as she walked out of the courtroom. "Careful with the law, Anna," she whispered as she passed me. "It's not as merciful as you think." I didn't respond. I stared at her, unblinking, and I realized that truth alone wouldn't be enough. I needed proof. 3 days later, while I was standing in a hospital hallway, I received a text from an unknown number. "You'll need this." Attached was an audio file. My palms were sweating as I plugged in my earbuds. It was Marlene's voice, undeniably hers. "I just need her dead so I can deal with that deed. The longer this drags on, the more of a headache it becomes." I froze. There was no voice replying. Just Marlene, alone. No cuts, no distortion. Every word, every syllable like a blade slicing through the polished mask she wore. I had no idea who sent it. I just knew I had to guard that recording like gold. I made 3 copies. One locked in the hospital's safe under the attending physician's name, one sent to Frank, and one stored on a USB drive I carried everywhere. I didn't mention it to my lawyer. I didn't inform the hospital. I just stayed by my grandmother's side, holding her hand and whispering, "You're not just my grandmother anymore. I'm a witness now. And I'm going to make sure the truth doesn't stay buried." I returned to her old wooden house one overcast afternoon, carrying the rusted key she used to keep in a sewing box on top of the wardrobe. The house still smelled the same: old fabric, damp wood, and a faint hint of mint tea. Everything looked untouched, like she'd just stepped out that morning. The old armchair by the fireplace, the faded cushion with family embroidered on it, and the half-knitted scarf still looped on the needles. I started tidying up. Something in me just knew to keep looking, pulling drawers, checking under beds. When I stepped into her small, blue-carpeted bedroom, I accidentally pressed down on a loose wooden plank. The hollow thud was unmistakable. I knelt down, lifted the rug, and pried up the board. Underneath was a small metal safe, dusty, cobwebbed, with a worn combination dial. I froze for a moment, unsure if I was trembling from cold or anticipation. I reached into my coat pocket for the old set of keys she'd given me on my 18th birthday. I'd never used them, but strangely, the third key, the one I always thought belonged to some lost drawer, fit perfectly. A soft click echoed like a secret finally confessed. Inside was a bundle of documents tied with blue ribbon, a sealed golden envelope, and a thick file stamped confidential. I carefully pulled everything out, hands slightly shaking. On top was my original birth certificate. The mother field was clearly filled in: Deborah Whitaker. I swallowed hard. Next to her name was a signature I recognized from the old letters: tilted, elegant, hers. No father's name, just an empty blank space. I had always known that, but seeing it in print hit differently. I opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, its ink faded with time. My dearest Anna, if you're reading this, it means I failed to keep my promise. I said I'd come back for you, that I'd take you away, but I never imagined they'd go this far. They forced me to sign away custody to Marlene. They threatened to use fabricated evidence to have Eleanor arrested. I couldn't fight back, not then. I had to leave, not because I abandoned you, but because I refused to let you grow up in the shadow of a case that never reached justice. I couldn't hold back anymore. I sank to the floor, clutching the letter to my chest. My mother hadn't died. She'd been forced to disappear, and I had lived my whole life believing I wasn't worth staying for. Beneath the letter was a case file. Deborah as the plaintiff. Defendants: Marlene Whitaker and a company called Northbridge Resource Group, filed in 2004 in San Bernardino County, California. Allegations: family asset theft, forged guardianship documents, elder financial abuse. In her handwriting at the bottom: case suspended. Pressured from within the court, I flipped to the last page, a handwritten will, dated March 12, 2005. It read: I, Deborah Whitaker, in sound mind, leave all my assets, including shares in Northbridge Resource Group, the property at 1428 Jefferson Street, and my personal credit holdings, to my daughter, Anna Whitaker, born April 21st, 1990. I looked around the room that had shielded me from so many storms, now opening a doorway to something clearer. No longer fog, just answers. I gathered everything, tucking the letter into the inner pocket of my coat. I glanced at the birth certificate, then at my reflection in the small mirror on the bedside table. I whispered into the still air, who am I in this story? Not the weak child left behind, not the girl blamed for nameless sins. I was the witness, the heir, the only child my mother had trusted to the very end, and I wouldn't let anyone bear the truth again. I returned to Frank's garage on a crisp, clear morning, carrying the bag with all the documents I'd found in the safe. Frank was wiping his hands with a cloth beside a lifted pickup. He spotted me and nodded slowly, then walked over. I think you should sit, he said, pointing to a wooden bench under the old oak tree. On the table was a thin file, the spine slightly bent with a few red-inked notes. I sat down, my pulse racing. Frank opened the folder and slid over a printed photo of a woman with light brown hair, piercing yet steady eyes staring into the camera, like she knew too much. She was the senior accountant at Northbridge Resource Group. In 2003, she filed an internal complaint for financial fraud involving their employee benefits fund. The recipient of that complaint, Frank paused, eyes locking with mine, was the VP of HR at the time, Marlene Whitaker. My hands clenched. My eyes stayed fixed on the photo. Below the image, Diana Smith, alias, True ID, Deborah Whitaker. Frank continued, voice steady. After that report, Deborah's bank accounts were frozen. Her daughter was removed from custody. She disappeared from all residency records after leaving California. Huh. Why didn't anyone find her? I whispered, throat dry. Because she didn't vanish. She was placed into an unofficial witness protection setup. A former in-house attorney helped her change her identity and relocate to a discreet facility for whistleblowers under threat. Frank pulled a slip of paper from his jacket. An address in southern Arizona. She's here, under the name Diana Smith. It's a private care home. No sign. No online presence. I said nothing, staring at the paper. My hands trembled as I took it, as if holding it could somehow turn back all those lost years. Frank placed a hand on my shoulder. You're not going alone. 2 days later, we drove across the Arizona desert, past red mountain ranges and endless fields of cactus. Frank was still the one behind the wheel. I sat beside him in silence, eyes on the window, but mind drifting toward a childhood that had never known the face of a mother. I kept wondering how I would look at her, if she truly existed. Would there be anger, pity, or just an empty space waiting to be filled? As the car turned onto a bumpy dirt road, a row of small adobe-colored houses came into view, surrounded by a low wooden fence and a few wildflowers blooming in the dry sun. A middle-aged woman in a white blouse stepped out from the front door. Frank rolled down the window and held up the slip of paper. We're here to see Diana Smith. She may not be expecting us, but this is her daughter. The woman stared at me for a moment, then turned back inside. Less than 3 minutes later, she returned and gave a slight nod. Room 6. She's doing well, but quiet. I stepped into the still hallway, feeling like something inside me was being pulled backward. The door to room 6 was slightly open. A woman with graying hair sat by the window, sunlight sweeping gently across her face, casting a glow over eyebrows faded by time. She didn't turn around when I entered, only spoke, soft as wind. I thought I'd never see those eyes again. I froze. She still hadn't turned, but her voice, each word pierced through the depths of memory. It was deeper than I remembered, but unmistakable. Anna, she whispered, is it you? I stepped closer, each movement like walking across gravel, made of old years. It's me! She turned. Her eyes widened for a moment, then softened into a gaze as calm as ripples on still water. There were no tears, no dramatic pause, just a hand reaching for mine, tight, like she feared one more breath would separate us again forever. You found me, I said softly, never letting go of her hand. I've been lost too long, she replied, then smiled gently. But I never forgot you, your face, your laugh, the way you hugged me, never blaming me, even when you had to grow up without me. I sat beside her, resting my head on her shoulder like a tired child. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel hollow anymore. I didn't need an explanation. I didn't need a defense. I just needed to know she was still here, and that the truth had finally found its light. I walked into the courtroom with my mother by my side, her hand wrapped tightly around my arm, as if every step demanded a lifetime's worth of strength. Her silver hair was neatly brushed. Her face still carried the quiet calm that had once been buried for 2 decades. She wore a dark brown wool coat, and on her wrist was the bracelet from the last photo I had of her, taken when I was 4. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Some faces I recognized as those who once averted their eyes from mine, now gathered like an audience, waiting for the climax of a play. I didn't look at them. I looked only toward the defendant's table, where Marlene sat, arms folded, still wearing her usual composed expression. but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. Judge Jansen opened the file in front of him, his voice calm and steady. This hearing is to reassess guardianship, financial authority, and the authenticity of documents related to Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, currently under special medical care. My attorney stood and began by presenting the video that had once been used to defame me. The original live stream clip has been restored and analyzed by an independent forensic team. What you'll see is the unedited version. The large screen lit up, the audio played clearly. In the video, Marlene was the one yelling, pulling Eleanor out of the car and pushing her to the ground. Her voice rang out, "Stay here! I'm not carrying this burden anymore." I stood just a few feet away, eyes filled with tears, trying to help her up. No one spoke when the clip ended. Not a whisper. As for the deed transfer, my lawyer continued, this is a copy of the agreement Marlene submitted in the last session, claiming Mrs. Whitaker voluntarily signed over the house for convenience. He held up a forensic report. The signature has been confirmed as forged. The ink used is a brand that only hit the market less than 8 months ago. The contract was dated 5 years ago. A cold draft seemed to pass through the room. The judge gave a small nod, face unreadable, but marked the file. We moved on to Eleanor's account statements from the last 6 months. Most large withdrawals had occurred during hospital stays or long-term treatments, times when she was physically incapable of initiating any transactions. We have an independent investigator's report tracing those funds through a network of shell companies, each eventually leading back to the legal office of Marlene Whitaker. Papers rustled. Someone in the back row let out a heavy sigh. I kept my eyes locked on Marlene. She didn't move, but her back stiffened. Her gaze wandered toward the ceiling. And finally, my attorney said, voice dropping, "This is a handwritten note from Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, penned just days before her condition prevented verbal communication." I stepped forward, holding the small, laminated sheet, the cursive tilted like the woman herself. I placed it on the evidence table and read aloud. Not loudly, but clearly enough for every word to land. "She's everything to me. I won't leave her behind again." No one in the room looked up. I saw the judge close his eyes briefly. No one had to ask who she was. No one needed to wonder why those words had been written in silence when she could no longer speak. Marlene's attorney attempted to challenge the note, suggesting Eleanor's mental state may have been compromised, but no one was listening anymore. The judge cut in. "This court finds an urgent need to protect the interests of Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker. Temporary guardianship is hereby granted to Miss Anna Whitaker. All assets will be frozen pending a full audit. Mrs. Marlene Whitaker is barred from financial or medical contact until further notice." I turned to my mother. Her eyes brimmed but didn't spill. She gripped my hand, tight enough that I could feel her pulse under her thin skin. "I never left," I whispered near her ear. "And now we stand here, together." The room gradually emptied. Marlene walked out without a word, but I saw her hand shake slightly. No one avoided my eyes anymore. They passed by quietly, slowly. No apologies were spoken, but that silence, it no longer held the shape of contempt. It held the shape of debt, and maybe of gratitude. I carried the ruling out of the courthouse with a feeling that wasn't relief and wasn't triumph. It felt more like something deep inside had cracked open, a small explosion in my chest. Not to celebrate, but to mark a line finally crossed. My mother walked beside me, her hand sliding into mine slowly. We didn't speak as we headed for the car. Every step weighed not with exhaustion, but with a quiet shift taking place inside me. Less than a week later, I was officially granted full guardianship and financial authority over my grandmother. All of her assets were placed under legal protection, supervised by me and a court-appointed financial officer. But for me, that wasn't enough. I had spent my youth beneath the suspicion of my own blood, every step shadowed by judgment, every word drowned in sighs and cold chuckles. If I stopped here, I wouldn't just be leaving my grandmother's justice incomplete. I'd be leaving the door open for others like Marlene to keep hiding behind masks no one dared to touch. Frank and I gathered every financial document from the past 3 years related to Marlene. The withdrawals from Grandma Eleanor's accounts weren't just personal expenses. Many were funneled into shell companies, businesses with no clear operations. Some had names I'd never heard before, but the addresses matched in eerie detail. Marlene's former office, or the one she used to register her so-called charity, Family Care Fund. We submitted everything to the Federal Financial Crimes Bureau. No warnings, no headlines, just proper channels. I remember Frank whispering that night as we sorted through the papers. Sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be written in the right place. A few weeks later, I got a call from an investigator. They had confirmed at least 5 criminal violations: money laundering, elder fraud, forgery of notarized documents, misappropriation of guardianship assets, and deliberate concealment of illicit funds under a family company's name. Marlene was arrested on a Monday morning at her suburban home. The news aired quietly on the local broadcast. Woman arrested on suspicion of manipulating seniors' assets, tied to a network of shell companies she created. My name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. I didn't show up to see her taken away, not because I didn't want to, but because I was at my grandmother's house, quietly placing a small wooden frame on the living room shelf. Inside it was a $2 bill, worn, edges crumpled, each corner sharply creased. I didn't flatten it, didn't laminate it. I wanted to keep it just as it was the day she was pushed from that car, clutching it in her hand like it was the only thing left in the world. Beneath the frame, I wrote one small line in black ink. This was what she was given when they deemed her worthless, and it was what awakened everything. That afternoon, my mother sat in the armchair by the window. I handed her a cup of mint tea and sat across from her. She looked at the frame and went quiet for a long while. "Did you ever wonder," she asked, "what you would do if you ever held that bill again?" I shook my head. At first, I kept it as proof of contempt, but not anymore. "What is it now?" she asked. "Now it's proof that people may think we're weak, but in the moment we're most dismissed. We discover exactly how strong we are." My mother smiled faintly. Marlene forgot that. She thought power came from controlling everything, but the one thing she couldn't control was memory. I looked over at her, and love. We sat in silence for a long time. The evening sun streamed through the window, casting a soft glow on the glass frame. The $2 bill lit up under the golden light as if no one had ever touched it, as if it were still in my grandmother's hand, as if it still held warmth. I never imagined I'd one day frame an insult. But today I did it, not to remember the pain, but to remind myself that truth sometimes begins in the smallest things. A bill, a glance, a quiet sentence can start a journey an entire family tried to bury. And that journey, now, cannot be stopped. The little house by the pine grove at the end of Maple Road became the first true home I ever had. Not because of fresh paint or modern furniture, but because all 3 of us lived under one roof, with no one forced to stay silent, no one afraid of being left outside. My mother moved in at the start of spring. She brought only 2 suitcases, some clothes, a few old books, and a small photo of me as a child sitting in her lap under the sunlit grass. That photo had been hidden for years during her time on the run. Now it rested openly on her nightstand, no longer needing to be concealed. As for Grandma, she could no longer speak, but her eyes still sparkled each morning when she saw me brewing tea, or when my mother brushed her hair beside the window. Her silence was no longer a void. It had become another language, full and tender. One glance, one squeeze of the hand was enough to understand. I decided to hold a small service at the chapel at the edge of town. No big signs, no fancy invitations, just a few close friends, neighbors who had quietly helped us, hospital staff, our attorney, and those who had witnessed some part of our journey. They sat quietly on wooden pews as I stepped onto the small wooden podium beneath the stained glass dome. In my hands was a handwritten draft, but I didn't read from it. I simply looked down at where my mother sat beside Grandma, her hand gently resting on Grandma's knee, like a silent reassurance. I used to think silence was a sign of weakness, I began. I used to fear that if I didn't fight back, didn't raise my voice, I'd be buried. I paused. The room held its breath. Only the wind whispered through the roof beams. But that woman sitting there, the one they called frail, silent, outdated, she taught me that patience is also a form of strength. And not everyone who stands still has given up. I took a deep breath. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm here to thank my grandmother, Eleanor, for never letting go, not even when the world turned its back. There was no applause, just bowed heads, a few wiped away tears. I stepped down and took Grandma's hand, placing in it a soft lavender sprig, the flower she used to grow each summer behind the house. In the months that followed, I began building something I never thought I could. A free legal center for seniors and those financially or legally abused by family members. We named it the $2 Trust. Frank helped me lay out the office, building every filing shelf by hand. My mother suggested the anonymous hotline and wrote our first grant proposal to independent donors. I drafted every rule, laid every floor tile, and on opening day, the first person who walked in wasn't a stranger. It was a 74-year-old woman, clutching her purse, whispering, "I need help. My son wants to sell the house without asking me." I offered her a seat, poured her some warm tea, and felt a circle inside me close. In my office, next to the desk, hangs a plain wooden frame. Inside it isn't a family photo, nor a diploma or award. It's the same $2 bill. I no longer see it as a symbol of humiliation. Each time I look at it, I remember that moment I knelt by the curb, lifting it from my grandmother's trembling hand. That moment is no longer a wound, it's a beginning. I was once left with nothing but a bill that couldn't buy a cup of coffee. Now, that same bill bears the name of a legal center helping others rise when they thought they had nothing left. I never told my mother I forgave her, and she never asked. We just lived together, cared for Grandma together, and sometimes sat on the porch in the afternoon, watching the leaves fall down the steps, without needing to explain anything anymore. Because some things, when spoken through action, through steady hands, through quiet continuation, make forgiveness unnecessary. And I know now I don't walk behind anyone anymore. I lead. Each of us might carry a $2 bill in our heart, figuratively or literally, a memory of being discarded, a moment of abandonment, or a voice no one wanted to hear. I'm telling this story not to stir up anger, but to ask a simple question. What might happen if we started listening to the small things? What if, instead of turning away, we paused and looked into the eyes of someone being pushed aside, whether that person is our grandmother, our mother, or the little version of ourselves? What do you think about this story? If you've ever gone through something similar or witnessed someone being treated unfairly in their own family, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Because it's only when we start speaking and truly listening that silence begins to break. And if you believe in the power of kindness, in justice being rewritten by the hands of those who lived it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Join me as we uncover more honest stories about family, memory, and healing, even when they begin with something as small as a forgotten old dollar bill.